On February 14, 1876, the lawyers of Elisha Gray arrived at the US Patent Office to submit a patent for the telephone, which contained a diagram illustrating the liquid transmitter design we discussed last episode. A few hours later, the lawyers of Alexander Graham Bell also arrived at the US Patent Office and submitted his patent for the telephone. His did not include any diagrams of a liquid transmitter, though it did contain a written mention of them. Once both applications had made it to the examiner, they suspended Bell's application for 3 months to allow Gray to submit a full patent application, as he had only submitted a patent caveat at the time. After which they would begin interference proceedings, which would be a process to determine who was actually the first to invent the telephone. The US at this point issued patents on a first-to-invent basis, not the first to file a patent. And it's from here things get really interesting. Ten days later, on February 24th, Bell travelled to Washington, D.C., the location of the patent office. He returned home to Boston on March 7th. On March 8, he recorded an experiment in his lab notebook, which contained a diagram suspiciously similar to what was contained in Gray's caveat. And on March 10th, Bell built a working telephone. Between sealed rooms in his house, he transmitted to his assistant Thomas Watson the now famous words, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." This seemed to place the matter beyond dispute because, despite the question of who submitted their application first, Bell was the first to invent a working device. But what was Bell doing in Washington, D.C. for those few days after his application was suspended? And why did he then suddenly return with a successful working design for the telephone? The patent examiner who was handling their submissions was a man named Zenas Fisk Wilbur, a Civil War veteran who had fought in the Civil War alongside his longtime friend Marcellus Bailey. And Bailey just so happened to also be Bell's lawyer. 10 years after the 1876 patent submissions, Wilbur submitted a written testimony that he was in fact an alcoholic and had owed money to Bell's lawyer, Bailey, and that he had contacted Bailey immediately after suspending Bell's application, telling him about Gray's caveat. When Bell arrived in Washington 10 days later, Wilbur claimed that he spent an hour with him, showing him Gray's diagrams and explaining his method to him, after which Bell gave him $100 and returned back to Boston to conduct his now suddenly successful experiments with the telephone. This information makes Bell seem extremely shady, but things get even murkier from here. Wilbur had less than a year earlier already submitted a written testimony that directly contradicted this one, only he now claimed that the older testimony was false because the Bell company had duped him into signing it while he was drunk and depressed. However, it also turned out that his most recent testimony that claimed Bell was a thief was actually drawn up for him by the lawyers of the Pan Electric Telephone Company, who were at the time being sued by the Bell Telephone Company for patent infringement. They clearly had an agenda to try and discredit the patents that Bell was claiming they had infringed. So which account of Wilbur was true, and can either be trusted? What does exist is fairly compelling evidence that Bell had already been experimenting with liquid transmitters for years prior, but it does raise the question why his original patent submission did not include this in more detail. Interestingly, there are records from years prior that show that Bell had always mistrusted Gray, in fear that he would spy on his work. So was it actually Gray who was the thief? Despite all of the mystery, the one fact that can't be disputed is that Bell did build the first working telephone. Or did he? Enter the Italian inventor Antonio Meucci. As a young man in Italy, while employed at the Teatro della Pergola, Meucci had built an acoustic telephone that allowed communication between the stage and the control room. Then later in Cuba, while employed to assist with electroshock therapy on patients with rheumatism, he discovered that he heard the screams of a patient transmit electronically through the wires. This led him in 1849 to develop a device he called the talking telegraph that allowed the inarticulate communication of the human voice. In 1850, he moved to the USA with his wife, whom in 1854 became an invalid due to rheumatoid arthritis. In 1856, in order to allow him to easily communicate with his wife from his basement laboratory, he installed a telephone-like device, and in his notes from 1857, almost 20 years before Gray and Bell's race to the patent office, he described what is essentially an electromagnetic telephone. He was running a candle factory at the time and intended to use that to finance his invention, but unfortunately his business soon went bankrupt and he found himself in poverty. In 1871, 5 years before Bell or Gray, he submitted a patent for the sound telegraph. Yet while he references the use of electricity throughout, he fails to describe any specific electromagnetic mechanism like the ones in his earlier notes, leading to this patent being legally useless in later legal battles. The argument being that his patent described an acoustic telephone, not an electric one, and thus had no claim to Bell's throne. Some argue that his lack of skill with English could have contributed to this, and his patent expired in 1874 due to lack of funds to renew it. In 2002, the US House of Representatives passed a resolution that said if Meucci had been able to pay the $10 fee to maintain the caveat after 1874, no patent could have been issued to Bell. However, that was far too late to benefit Meucci, who despite multiple legal battles was unable to provide enough material evidence for his invention, and was accused of falsely backdating his personal notes for evidence, eventually dying in poverty in 1889. It is possible that had he simply had more business sense and a better grasp of English, he would have been universally hailed as the inventor of the telephone over either Alexander Bell or Elisha Gray. But would he have been hailed as the inventor of the telephone over the German Philip Reis, who in 1861 invented a device that could convert sound waves into electrical impulses that could be converted back to acoustic sound at the receiver end, and even coined the term telephone to describe it. His invention was widely hailed and witnessed throughout Europe, praised for its particular success in transmitting music, though it struggled to clearly transmit speech. Even Thomas Edison, who would later refine the telephone with the invention of the carbon microphone, stated that the first inventor of the telephone was Philip Reis of Germany, only musical, not articulating. So who actually invented the telephone? Was it Bell, Gray, Meucci, or Reis? Or was it Innocenzo Manzetti, another Italian inventor, who in 1840 built a flute-playing automaton, and in an attempt to give his automaton the power of speech was reported to have created the first speaking telegraph in 1865, as related in a Parisian newspaper. Manzetti transmits directly the word by means of the ordinary telegraphic wire, with an apparatus simpler than the one which is now used for dispatches. Now 2 merchants will be able to discuss their business instantly from London to Calcutta, announce each other's speculations, propose them and conclude them. And yet he did not seek a patent. In a run of misfortune, his first daughter died at the age of 2. Then his second daughter died almost on the exact same date that Bell conducted his first successful experiment in America. And 1 year later, he would die on his 51st birthday in poverty and obscurity. What does any of this have to do with process? It tells us that ideas are nothing when not paired with the right process. The idea to create the telephone was clearly not unique, but only one man was able to bring that idea into the right process to yield a successful result, and then was able to continue that process until he had yielded an easily replicable design that then took over the world. And that man was Alexander Graham Bell. And the simple idea of being able to hold a conversation with another person over great distances is what birthed the process we will discuss next episode, when the limitation of needing cables became too much, and a new process was born that allowed us to send invisible signals through the air.